Hello, everybody, and welcome to this Lit in Colour event. I'm Sarah Shaffi. I'm a journalist and author, and I'm going to be talking today with Kamila Shamsie about her novel Home Fire and putting your questions to her. Lit in Colour is a campaign that the publisher Penguin Books runs in partnership with race equality think tank the Runnymede Trust. Bloomsbury, which is the publisher of Home Fire, is a partner of the Lit in Colour campaign. Lit in Colour is all about supporting schools to make the teaching of English more inclusive of writers of colour. The Lit in Colour Pioneers pilot is supporting 100 schools which have changed their GCSE and or their A-level to Pearson EdXL specification, which enables students to study set texts by writers of colour. One of those texts happens to be Home Fire, written by the award-winning author Kamila Shamsie. Today we're going to have Kamila talking to us all about her novel, about how she approached writing the book, the main themes, the context in which it's set, and what she wants readers to take away from the characters that she wrote about in Home Fire. There is a Q&A portion of our conversation, so please do get your questions ready and feel free to add them to the chat box at any point during the event. I'm just going to give a brief introduction to Kamila before she joins us on screen. Kamila Shamsie was born and grew up in Karachi in Pakistan. Home Fire won the Women's Prize for Fiction in 2018 and was also longlisted for the Man Booker Prize in 2017, shortlisted for the Costa Best Novel Award, and won the London Hellenic Prize. She is the author of other novels, including Burnt Shadows, which was shortlisted for the Orange Prize, and A God in Every Stone, shortlisted for the Women's Prize and the Walter Scott Prize. And she's just released a new novel, Best of Friends. Welcome, Kamila. It's lovely to have you here with us today.
Thank you very much, sir. Happy to be here. Thank you to everyone who's listening who can't see.
So Home Fire is a retelling or a reimagining, I don't know if there's a word you prefer, of Sophocles' Antigone. And I wondered if you could begin by telling us when you first came across that play and what your sort of initial experiences of it were.
Well, this is, a terrible thing to admit in an educational context, but I first encountered it at university. I was taking a classics course, and it was a very intensive reading semester. So it was one of many books I read, and I have to say, I cannot remember what that initial encounter was. And it didn't leave a mark, which now strikes me as very strange. And then many, many, many years went by, and I had an email from a man who ran a theatre called Tara Arts in London. And he said, "Come in, I want to talk to you about something." And when I went there, he said, "I really like the way you do dialogue, and I'd like you to write a play for me." And I said, "I don't know how to write a play." And he said, "Well, I thought you might say that. So why don't you adapt one that someone else has already written? Because then, they've done all the hard work." And he was one to say, the Greek tragedy is having a real revival, and something like Antigone in a contemporary context might be interesting. And I'm ashamed to say that I pretended to remember Antigone and said, "Yes, let me go and think about that." And then literally got on the tube home and went and looked up the plot summary. And although I don't remember that first encounter with Antigone as a student, I remember so clearly looking at the plot, and I sort of was, approaching it with skepticism. Oh, I don't know how to write a play. And as I was looking at the plot, and this was in the very early days when the newspaper started to have these stories of young Britons going to join ISIS. And there were all these conversations around it, and are they really British, and what should be done? And I had read a story recently about the sister of a boy who'd gone to join ISIS, and her sadness. And as I was reading the plot summary, I just remember thinking, this is now, this is, and almost immediately in my memory, seeing how those stories could be overlaid. It was a funny thing because when I was reading the stories in newspapers, it almost seemed too immediate to write about. But suddenly there was a
Mm.
2,000-year-old story saying, actually, this is not a new thing. You can find an old way to talk about new things, or a new way to talk about old things.
Mm. It certainly does seem that Greek sort of plays and stories have been having a moment for a number of years now. It's a very long moment. But what is it about the core things that they touch on that do still mean that they are relevant today, and that we can sort of place the stories and politics and culture and social moments of our time into that sort of context that they were also using back then?
I think there are a number of things. One, I'm going to say maybe a little controversially, is there's an insistence on hope in the present moment. I was hearing someone the other talk about a book that was clearly taken on very, very difficult subject, and then the person said, "No, no, but it's okay. There is hope there." you know and I thought, we sometimes it's okay to just look at the thing and think, this is horrifying. And I think the Greeks were
Mm,
very good at that they just looked horror straight in the eye, and they said, this is what it is. And I think sometimes we feel that there is an honesty in that, and just saying horrific things are horrific. We don't need to find the hope in them. We can go somewhere else for a moment of hope, perhaps, but let's just call horror what it is. But I think, I mean, if you were to look specifically at Antigone, I think there is an interest in things like the relationship of the individual to the collective. Um, or, with Antigone, there's this very much a question of what is justice? Is justice the laws of the kingdom set by whoever the king is? Or is there a higher ideal of justice, whether it springs from religion or it springs from some idea of morality, or it springs from what feels like an emotional truth? Um, and I think Antigone herself became particularly important in the 20th century, where she really became a figure of civil disobedience, and this whole idea of non-violence resistance to an oppressive power became so significant. And if you look a few years ago, I would have said, oh well, Malala Yousafzai is a kind of Antigone, and today I might say Greta Thunberg is a kind of Antigone. Um, so I think this figure of the individual with her powerful voice. In Iran, you're having all kinds of Antigones. I think those are stories we very much appreciate, and I think also the Greek chorus. I think the way we sort of can now see the Greek chorus as kind of public opinion, as it moves and sways and is fickle, but is also important and reflective of a society. I think all these things combine.
mm. So we heard that initially this started life as a play or a would-be play. Did you write any of that play, and at what point did it turn into a novel and the novel we see now?
Yeah. So here's the thing: is at the time I had that meeting, I was between novels, and I didn't have an idea for the next novel, and I would really have liked to. And I did, because I believe in being quite, honorable if I can. And someone had said, here's an idea for a play. And I felt it was my responsibility to sit down and try and do a play. And my brain wouldn't do it. My brain kept seeing chapters. Because, of course, some part of my brain, which is not at all honorable, thought, oh my God, this is an amazing novel idea. So then I just thought, well, so much for honor. And I started to write it as a novel. And then wrote to the man, Jatinder Verma, who had, who was the director, and said, I'm really sorry and also thank you. And he was remarkably gracious about it and said, you write something for me some other time. Let's have a launch event for you at my theatre when the book is out.
Wonderful. Some people will have read the whole book, and some people will be sort of familiar with parts of it. So siblings are really central to the story, and we spend some time with each of Anika, Parvez, and Isma. Tell us about creating these three siblings and getting into the minds of each of them, and sort of being able to write each of them and their various similarities, but also their huge differences as well.
So when I decided that, or when I first started to think about working on it, I don't read Greek, so I was reading different translations of the book and trying to find a way in, which was really just my way of saying I wanted these characters to become flesh and blood characters for me, and for me to see who they were. And in the Anne Carson translation of Antigone, there's a moment right in the opening scene, and it's where these two sisters are in an argument because their brother has died, and the tyrant has said, because he's a traitor, he can't be buried, and his body will be left to rot for the animals to peck at. And one sister says, well, this is terrible, but it's the law, there's nothing we can do. And the other sister says, I will bury my brother, will you help me? And the first sister says, no, I can't be any part of it. And the second sister, Antigone, gets very angry, but there's a point when she's trying to just break away from her sister, and Her sister says, "I'm always on your side, however much I disagree with you." Um, and Antigone says, "Well, if something happens to me, what difference does it make to you? You know, you've chosen against me, you're not on my side." And the other sister, Ismene, just looks at her and says, "I'll be so lonely." And in those four words, I understood something of the dynamic of these two sisters as I was going to create them. That one is so caught up in her brother's death, it's all she sees, and she sees the wrong that's being done to him. Um, and she can't really see anything else in her grief and her rage. Whereas her older sister, as I conceived of it, though someone later said actually in the play Antigone is the older one, but I very much saw Ismene, who becomes my Isma, as the older sister who thinks, my brother's dead, my parents are dead, you are the only family left. And you're going to do something that will get you in terrible trouble and it'll take you away from me as well. And I can't lose you. I'll be so lonely. And so, right then, I just had that dynamic of the two of them. And I saw Ismene Isma as the older one who is worrying. But what I also saw in that moment is that Isma Ismene loves Antigone slash Anika the most. And Antigone slash Anika loves her brother, Polynices slash Pervez, the most. And the brother basically went and did what he was going to do without a second's thought for how the consequences it would have for his sisters. And that
Yeah.
really was
So
where that starts from. Yeah.
So I was going to ask about this because the relationship between these siblings, as it is with any siblings, is complicated. But obviously, being fiction, you can do a bit more with it. And Isma, as well as sort of being like a parent as well for her younger siblings because they their parents are no longer around. And Anika is a protector of Parvez, even though they're twins, they're the same age. And there does seem to be, like you said, I don't know if hierarchy is the right word, but a sort of levels of love each of them have for each other and that feeds into their loyalties as well. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that because I think it's not something that's often acknowledged that actually probably in families some people love
Yeah.
each other more than they love other people.
I think it's very much that Isma is sort of a maternal figure, and that means in some way that the twins don't think about her as much as they think about each other, in the way that you can
Mm,
take a parent for granted. Whereas they're in the schoolyard together, and the way I always imagined it was that Anika is the really popular, confident one, and Pervez is sort of the quieter, and that she sort of is used to standing up for him and looking out for him in the schoolyard. um, I'm very sort of, that was how I conceived of them. And they sort of take Isma for granted because, in the way you do. Um, and that Isma, it's not so much that I think that she grows up loving Pervez less, but I think when he leaves, I think she just becomes very angry with him because she sees him doing what their father did, which is leave and not care about the family. And I think there's a way in which it sort of is a reflection of how she thinks of her father was, I'm not going to have another male of this family just leave us bereft. I'm going to be angry with him and I'm going to think about how to protect those who remain. Um, and there's also a part where that thinks he's made his decision, he's gone, there's nothing I can do, but maybe I can do something for the one who's still here. What can I do for her? Because she
mm,
can see that Anika's in trouble. She just doesn't know what kind of trouble or what she'll do about it, but she knows there's some kind of emotional difficulty and she wants to protect her, and doesn't really know how to. And I think she does let her anger at Pervez, which is also deeply an anger at her father. I think she does let it cloud the love she's always felt for him.
mm. Can you expand a little bit more about how the shadows of excuse me, how the shadows of their lost parents impact on the Pasha siblings? So, are there sort of ideas of inherited trauma that you were looking to explore?
Sorry, yeah, it's that time of year where one or the other of us is bound to have a cough. Um, I'm just going to go and answer the part of the question that Sarah had asked, which is, so with the father, I knew, so in the play, of course, they are the children of Oedipus. There is this idea of a sort of sin that is being inherited from the parent, and in the play it's incest. And when I was thinking about how to adapt it, my first thought was, well, obviously I don't want this to be an incest story. I'm not going to have that in any way. But what I then thought was, actually, what I do want in there is the idea of some family shame that they're living with, and that's how I conceived of the idea that the father would actually be someone who um, had been fighting in Afghanistan at the time that the Americans went in against the Taliban, and that he dies on his way to Guantanamo. And there's this sort of very gray legal area. They never really know what he did, what happened to him. He never stood trial. And it's possible for them to think of him in these different ways. So for Anika, she just doesn't think of him. He's not there. He chose to leave them. And she's, in some ways, the most black and white of all the characters in terms of how she's thinking. Um, and Isma's the only one old enough to have known him. You know, she knew him, she loved him, she thought he loved her. And then he just leaves. He goes off to fight jihad. And I think the most hurtful thing is when he has a son, that matters to him. The son he's never met seems to matter to him more than the daughter he knew and who adored him. And she's very angry and is willing to side with her mother, who just wants to say, we need to cut him out of our life. We can't talk about him, because if everyone knew who he was and what he did, that would bring shame on the family. People would treat you differently. There's all this prejudice against Muslims, and it would feed into it. So she's able to sort of go along with the idea that we don't discuss him. Um, and for Pervez, it's more complicated. Pervez grows up in a house of women, um, and he's a boy who wants a father figure and never really has that. And all he knows is there's this silence and secrecy and shame around his father. Um, and that means when someone does turn up to say, I can tell you about your father, and actually he was a hero and he loved you and you need to be proud of him, that is a really significant moment for Pervez. And it's of course something that can be exploited in him, is this vulnerability and this searching for a father, and the sense that he's, all the women of the family are always telling him what to do, and he quite likes the idea of this very different kind of story where men are the one who are powerful and men are the ones who are in control. I think those are, with the three of them, these different ways in which the father plays into it. But I also want to have the sense of, actually, they are the generation who come after 9/11 and 7/7. They are Britons growing up in Muslim. They are Muslims growing up in Britain, and almost their whole life there has been this idea that some Muslims should be treated as terrorists and outsiders, and in a way that isn't strictly legal. So I very much wanted that to show they are the generation after the 9/11 generation.
Thank you for that, and apologies. Hopefully, I won't cough more. Um, so the other parent that is significant in the novel is Karamat, who's Eamon's father. He's very much present in a way that the Pasha siblings' father isn't. In what way is his impact on Eamon both similar to and different from the Pasha siblings' father's impact on them?
Um, so Qayamat is this hugely successful figure, um, and he has a son who grows up quite pampered and spoiled and rich, and is, I think, aware from a very early age that he can't be the kind of figure his father is. He doesn't have that sort of ambition, um, or drive, and I think in a way, he probably chooses to say, I'm not even going to compete, because if I compete, I'll end up looking second best. So it's almost as though, as a form of self defense, so to not be compared to his father, he goes in the opposite direction and becomes this kind of, drifting young man who can afford to do a lot of nothing. Um, but he's also, there's a gentleness in him, I think, but also he's very cut off from his Pakistani or Muslim heritage, because his father's political choices are such that Karamat Loan's family cuts him off. So it's not that Karamat starts off saying, I don't want anything to do with my British Pakistani family. It's that his own politics and rhetoric about Muslims make the family say, we don't want anything to do with you. And at that point, Eamon stops having contact with the family. Um, and because of sort of the social world he moves in, also to some extent because he has a white American mother and he looks as though he could kind of be from anywhere, he's able to pass, and his name as well. And so he largely isn't aware of, he doesn't think of himself as being of Pakistani heritage, of Muslim descent. And yet there is a part of him that is so curious about his father's background and sort of feels that there is some key to understanding his father that lies in his roots, in his family, in the world he grew up in, which Karamat doesn't speak about. And I think that is part of what draws him first to the Pashas is, they live in the same part of town that his father's family lived in. And it almost starts with him not so much wanting to know the Pashas as wanting to know who his father was through the Pashas.
Um, with the character of Kramat, and I'd love to talk about him a bit more in a second, but with him or just generally through the novel, was there something that you were looking to say about assimilation and integration, which I feel like are words that have been talked about a lot in the past few years?
So, when I write a novel, I never write it because there's something I want to say and always because there's something I want to explore. So I was, and, I moved to Britain in 2007. I'm a relatively recent citizen here. I became a citizen in 2013. And I'd spent time in London before, but when you spend time somewhere as a visitor, it's very different to living in a place and being on the path to citizenship. And there were all these conversations that were going on about Britishness and what it meant. And really, it was a conversation that was clearly about British Muslims. um, and can you be a Muslim and also believe in democracy, and these sort of really weird ideas of will you want to follow Sharia law rather than the law of the land, and these really sort of convolutions that Britain seemed to get itself into because it started to regard one aspect of its own population as possibly the enemy within. And I was sort of really intrigued by that and intrigued by, so what are not just one, but I want to look at different ways in which these different families and different characters respond to the idea of being British and being Muslim. From at one extreme, Eamon, who to whom the words Muslim and Pakistani mean nothing in the beginning, and then to Isma, for whom being Muslim is a question of deep faith, and yet that doesn't get in the way in any way of her thinking of herself as being British, and yet at some point it's a country she wants to leave because there's too much in it that feels you know just too much for her. And so it was really about wanting to explore those different ideas, but also it wasn't just that I want to explore how British Muslims are taking on ideas of assimilation and integration. Want to look at how Britain itself is talking about and thinking about, and the laws it's enacting around questions of citizenship.
Yeah, which is obviously still relevant today. And when this novel was released, and many people, and I was among them, sort of talked about how prescient it was in terms of the political situation, and particularly in terms of Karamat, an Asian Home Secretary, the first Asian Home Secretary. And you mentioned that you'd sort of read news articles about it was when young people were first sort of going out to join ISIS. But how much of um, the prescience of this novel, and indeed writing in general, is because as an author, part of your job is to be really observant and perhaps hone in on those things that will become important before we realize and sort of take proper notice of them.
Yeah, very much. I mean, I'd like to claim that I have some ability of clairvoyance. I have none. I just, there are some news stories that catch your attention. And in terms of Karamat, I was interested in the fact that there was, in a relatively short period of time, there were three um, politicians who were from Pakistani and Muslim backgrounds. And it so happened that all three of them had fathers who were bus drivers as well at some point. And that's Saida Warsi, Sajid Javed, and Sadiq Khan. Um, And I thought that's really interesting because just a generation earlier, you would be hard pressed to find one quite prominent politician who was from that background. Um, and I thought, well, one is an anomaly, two is a coincidence, but three is a sign of something you need to pay attention to. Um, and it's been so interesting to see those trajectories. And Saida Varsi has really sort of, fallen away, which was, I think, it first happened because of she wanted to talk about Palestine and Gaza in a certain way that the Tory party wasn't happy about. And she's wanted to talk a lot about Islamophobia, which the Tory party isn't happy about. Sadiq Khan has made a role for himself as mayor of London in this way where it's, you know, I'll open the Pride parade in Ramadan while fasting, and that, but it's sort of within this world of a certain kind of multicultural progressive London. And then you have Sajid Javed, who is, became really this very, and was already, I mean, the signs were already there in his politics that he was clearly um, taking the line of, I'm going to be very right wing on migration. I'm going to be, devoted to the Queen. I'm going to absolutely deny that Muslimness has anything to do with my life. So all these things, and I was sort of looking at the three of them. Um, and I was most interested in that third figure who, very much is a product of his background, and yet there are certain parts of it he's sort of, making a point to distance himself from. So I thought this is interesting. I thought of these three, and actually I started to write it before Sadiq Khan had become mayor, although by the time the book was published he was. And I thought one of them is going to make it really, really far, um,
Mm,
at least. Wasn't quite
definitely.
sure which one it was. Yeah.
Well, I mean, given the sort of the current political situation and what we have seen, particularly through the Home Secretary role, did you continue to think that the novel would be sort of as relevant? I mean, we've obviously got Suella Braverman now, but uh, Preeti Patel, and kind of it seems that it's gone even a step further from, or more than a step further from the world that you set out in your book.
Yeah, it's an odd one, isn't it? When you write a novel, there are a lot of things about it that you want to. I mean, you write a novel to outlive its political moment. So it doesn't have to rely on the things you're writing about still being in the news stories. And one of the things that I was very grateful, it had sort of become part of the past was by the time the book was published. And when I was writing the book, when I started it, ISIS was very much expanding its territories and having military victories, and more people were going to join them. And by the time the book came out, they'd been really militarily defeated, and you weren't hearing those stories anymore. So I was very grateful that that part of it was in the past, and I don't think I would have anticipated how swiftly that would happen. Um, but no, I didn't anticipate that it would be sort of one Asian Home Secretary after another enacting more and more racist laws against migrants with the sort of defense of, you can't call me racist because I'm Asian, and but of course you immediately see how effective that is, um, as a sort of rhetorical move. And I also didn't, think that, I mean, I knew the story of citizenship stripping was already happening, but the way the story of Shamima Begum became front page news, and that citizenship stripping story happened, and it's still, she's still in this sort of limbo state, 5 years after the book came out. Well, I would have hoped that that kind of thing would be history as well.
Mm. As well as sort of exploring questions of Britishness, what makes a good Brit. You also explore um, the idea of who a Muslim is, what makes a good Muslim, what makes a Muslim. How did you want to address that in your novel and present sort of these varied and nuances and myriad experience of Muslim people?
Well, precisely by doing that, by saying there isn't, you can't say good Muslim, bad Muslim, and that the good Muslim has to be, loyal to the state, and, or something silly like that. That actually there are, even within a family, there are different kinds of ways in which people respond to religious identity. That in some cases it can be a sort of political awakening. I mean, Eamon, I think, has a little bit. He starts to, even if he doesn't own the word Muslim for himself, I think that would feel false to him. But he does start to feel an affinity or an understanding. Um, Whereas, Isma is a person of deep faith. Pervez gets more drawn to sort of political rhetoric around an extreme form of um, political Islam. Um, Anika Anika sort of prays and wears hijab, but there's no evidence that Anika deeply thinks about religion ever. And I want to just show that you can't say this person is a Muslim, therefore we know something about either their relationship to Britain or their relationship to Islam or their relationship to anything at all. You have to, work out what their particular version of being a British Muslim is.
Mm. Do you think and I mean, if have people sort of spoken to you or written to you about parts of the novel that has have surprised them, and is that one of the bits that surprises them the most, the sort of the types of Muslim that the characters are?
Um, it's interesting the different reactions I get to the book depending on who's talking to me. I've had a number of British Muslims come up to me and saying thank you, because usually when we see Muslims in fiction or represented, there are versions we don't recognize, and it's very nice to see versions we recognize. And then there are other people who are not Muslim who just say thank you, we live in this country and we have no idea about the kinds of stories and lives that are going on. So those are more the sort of responses that you'll get, and then of course, you write a novel, it's been around enough, people have read it, you'll get every variation from. Last week I had a woman in hijab saying, "Thank you for the way you write about women in hijab," and I've also had people saying, "You don't know anything about women in hijab," and so you're going to get every kind of response there is, but largely it has been overwhelmingly positive, honestly, in a way, Sarah, that surprised me, because I did think of all the novels I've written, I did think this was the one I would get the most kind of resistance to from different kinds of readers, either people objecting to what they might see as my sympathy for the person going to join ISIS, or if they think that my representation of, British Muslims is not what it should be. Um, and I'm someone who didn't grow up British. I didn't grow up in this country, so they could say you don't know what it's like to grow up here. So I was actually really sort of bracing myself with this novel for a lot of resistance, and was surprised that of everything I've ever read, it's the one that's had the least resistance. So you never know.
I wonder if that's because given how many of the things you've written about have been sort of headline news, I wonder if it's partly because perhaps people were looking for a more sort of nuanced way of looking at those issues rather than those kind of sensationalist headlines, and were perhaps looking for something that was going to try and help them understand. And I guess in some ways fiction can do that where non-fiction or sort of short journalism perhaps can't.
Possibly. I mean, I think that that's quite likely to be the response, that there was so much sort of sensationalist reporting, and this way in which um, I remember all these sort of journalists saying, when people started going to ISIS, saying we've never had anything like this. And I'm thinking, this is Britain. People always going off to fight for someone else's cause. You've had this all along. It's very English to do this, but there was a sort of terror. There was a very deep terror, and I can understand it because you know the entire propaganda machine of ISIS was built around creating this image of terror, and they were being very successful at it. And every time the news here was saying something like, "We've never seen anything like it," and "We don't understand it," it was helping to create that myth. And I do think that people very often, when there's a story they've just been seeing one version of endlessly, um, I think they do like a novel where you can sink into a much more detailed look at what ends up being really quite recognizable human character and responses, even if you disagree with what they do. And I don't think you could read this book without disagreeing with at least someone in it. But it's not beyond comprehension. It's not as though some new kind of human has been existed has been invented to make these choices.
I think I'm going to go to some audience questions now because I wanted to ask about the ending, but we've had some questions in about the ending, and sort of why you made it happen the way in which you did. And I wondered if that was obviously partly that structure of the Greek tragedy as well that sort of led you to the structure of this novel.
So I'm going to try and answer this in a non-spoilery way. When I started to work on it, one of the first things I told myself was that wherever I thought it would be necessary for the novel, I would move away from Antigone itself, the original. So I didn't want to be tied down by it. So which meant that I left myself the opening I had thought to end it in one of various ways, and I thought the ending could, be something very different. But it's interesting. The further you get into a novel, the fewer options you feel you have as a writer. I mean, you start off, you have anything could happen here, and the more you're writing, the more sort of the trajectory becomes clearer. Um, and so when I was writing that ending, a bit of my brain actually thought there might be a little bit after this. I didn't know it was going to end at that moment where it did. And I wrote what is now the last sentence of the book. And I remember just thinking, oh my God, that's it. This is the end. That there is nothing, you just know very deeply, there is nothing I can add that would make this a better ending. Or it felt like the natural conclusion of it. And also that there is, um, again, to how do we say this in a non-spoilery way? Um, there is the moment the novel ends, and then there is what people will imagine happens a few seconds later. And I do sometimes get that question of why didn't you give us a few seconds later? To which my answer is, um, it was the little kindness I could do to characters and readers.
Mm. Because novels, when novels finish, any novel, there is always a world after that, the end. But I guess, and again, to keep it fairly non-spoilery, although I think a lot of people judging from the questions have sort of got to the end. I guess it's just that yours was a lot more abrupt and sort of you feel like, oh, there are really some unanswered questions, but really all writing does that. I guess all novels do that in a way.
I think what I wanted with the novel, and one of the questions I particularly get around the ending was a lot of people say, "Well, we wanted Isma to come back," and I say, "Good. I'm glad you wanted Isma to come back." First of all, there are two reasons why Isma doesn't come back, and one is because I was very clear that the structure was going to be a kind of pass the baton storytelling style, where you move from one character to another, and you run through the five of them, and that is the novel. And I always had that in my head. But also because I want you at the end to be thinking of Isma, and but I want you as to be thinking of her as the reader, and wondering and taking what you know of her already, um, and wondering what happens to her and how she responds, and feeling for her. um, and but I thought I don't need to write that. If I've done my job well enough, you as the reader will be able to, I mean, I did bring her back in a scene with Karama just because I did want her back at some point. I didn't want her to leave the story entirely at the beginning. um, but I thought at this point she's in your hands and in your head.
Or somebody has actually exactly asked, said that they wanted to see Isma back at the end. So thank you for anticipating that question. Somebody has asked, what do you want readers to take away from the novel?
I don't know, because I don't know what readers are bringing to the novel. I mean, it's I love knowing what readers have taken away. But as I said, for me, it was an exploration. And in some ways, it was about me being a newly minted British citizen. So it was me exploring what Britishness means and what it is to be British and Muslim and Pakistani. And so it was not, this is what I want you to take away, because you could have much firmer ideas of these things and much clearer ideas of these things than I do. And I'm interested in how different people read it. And some people read it as a love story, and some people read it as a very political story, and some read it as a way of understanding um, people who they only know through news headlines. And I love that about a novel, is that it has these very different ways for you to enter it. So my only real answer, and I know this is kind of feels like a cop out answer, I do hope it makes people think and feel. But beyond that, what they think and feel is actually the question. I love this is why I like meeting readers and getting responses, because it's often so fascinating and eye opening what people are taking away based so much on what they brought to it.
Thank you very much for that, and thank you for that question. Another question's come in. Do you think it could have been possible for Anika and Isma's relationship to be repaired, or was the ultimate ending of the relationship inevitable?
Oh, I think siblings can repair all kinds of things, and time can. Anika's 19, you know. I mean, who wants to say that a rupture that happens when you're 19 is the one that will still be there when you're 90? I
Mm,
mean, I really do. I mean, now we're going to get into hope, but I mean, I do believe that as humans we have such capacity for all kinds of very strong emotions, and love is very much there in Anika and Isma's relationship. And it is, I would say, at the foundation of their relationship is about love.
mm,
So when that's the case, I'm never someone to say that a rupture is going to be final. The question is, how much time and under what circumstances does a thing heal, and also does what kind of scar remains and what kind of scar tissue remains? Because you know, even when things heal, they don't go back to where they were before.
mm. Well, talking of love, I'll ask you another love-focused question. And again, this might be one where you say it's sort of up to readers to decide, but somebody has asked, does Anika really love Eamon?
I'm so not answering that one. Um, Here's the thing: there are certain things when you write, you want people to be, you sort of want to say, look, this is a fact, this is the truth of the novel. And then there are a lot of other things where you want to say there's room for interpretation. So I would say with that one, there's room for interpretation, and also that um, the one clue I'll give is about how I often think about it. Um, is I don't think yes and no are the only two possible answers to that question.
Brilliant, thank you. So a few different schools have asked, why did you write Anika's narrative in the style that you did?
Um, as I was approaching because I wrote the novel very much as you have it, which is first Isma, then Eamon, then Pervez. And when it came to Anika, one of the things I was really thinking, how do I tell this? Because I knew that Anika would be in pieces. When we come to that section, I knew she was in pieces. Um, and sometimes actually other writers help you out. And I was reading Max Porter's Grief is a Thing with the thing with feathers, which is in these sort of shorter bits and fragments. And I thought, yeah, there's something about grief that this form is conveying very effectively. And so I wanted that sense of her shattering to be there in the form of the novel as well. That she's not going to sit there and do a kind of linear from one moment to the next, because also in the way that grief is, it's sort of, things come in bursts and waves. So I wanted to get that on the page.
And so a follow-on question from that, somebody has asked, why did you choose to write the novel character by character?
Um, so here's the thing about writers is we often don't know the answer to very good questions. Um, I think when I first started to think about it, that I had a moment where I was wondering whether I would tell it as Isma's story. And so I think I had in my head this idea of Isma telling the story. And then I thought, no, there's too much she wouldn't know. And there's too much she wouldn't be there for. And it just came to me that, and then as I was thinking about that, I thought, well, of course, one of the interesting things is to tell a story in a way that you see these different characters and they're all thinking about each other and themselves, but in very different ways. Um, and I thought it would be interesting to do it in that way, that um, you see how Isma thinks about Karamat alone, for instance. But then at some point you're going to get inside Karamat's head and see how he sees himself. And then you have to, as a reader, sort of weigh up, well, this is how Isma thought about him, this is how he thinks about himself, this is how his son thinks about him, and have a sort of almost a hall of mirrors effect where you are in the person's head and you're also viewing them, from these different angles. Um, and I thought part of the story is that it's about, I think one of the things I'm interested in a writer is unknowability, the
Mm,
unknowability of yourself and of other people, and how you can grow up in a house with people and still there are blindnesses. And I think part of that comes out of maybe those original news articles where there'd be family members saying, my brother, my son, whoever left, I had no idea this is what they planned. If they had, I would have called the authorities to stop them from going, because now I've lost this family member. This whole idea you could live in a house with someone and not know this incredibly momentous thing they're going to do.
mm. Wonderful, thank you. Um, so somebody asks, how has the childhood and family relationships contributed to shape the masculine identity of the male characters?
Hmm. So I think Pervez is the one with whom that's the most obvious, is that he grows up in a family of women, but in a world that is quite misogynist and patriarchal. So when Farouk comes along, he's that part of Pervez that lives in this world which says, men should be strong, men should be at the head of the family, men should be commanding. Farouk's really able to exploit that by saying, why are the women making all these decisions? And you should be a man. And this idea of being a man, it's interesting when you have ebooks out of your novels, you can see the lines that people mark the most. And in Home Fire, the line that is marked the most is the one which says, I hope I can remember it now. For girls, becoming a woman was inevitability. For boys, becoming a man was an ambition. Um, and as a woman, I'm really interested in the way that from a very early age, I grew up in a co-ed school, and actually most of my friends were boys, but from a very early age, you realize there's this idea of what it means to be a man, and there's a certain right way to be a man, and that it is very infused with all kinds of ideas of masculinity. And it's not just what your family is telling you, it's what the world is telling you. So with Parvez, I think the fact of this absent father on whom any kind of vision of masculinity could be projected, and including the most damaging kind, which is to do with picking up a gun and going to fight a war and leaving the women behind. I think that
Mm,
has a very big impact on who he is. Um, and he sort of keeps feeling that he's failing to be that. And of course, he's a man in many ways that his father was, I think, but he doesn't believe that. And with Karamat and Eamon, it's different. I think Eamon is so the best at not being bothered about this. This is the way to be a man, because he looks at his father and thinks there are all kinds of problems with the way you're being a
mm,
man, and yet there's a bit of him that also really wants his father's respect and knows he can't live up to him, and things like that. Uh, with Karan, I don't love his background, break from it, um, and grows away from it. But I think he sees himself as, I think the phrase self-made man sits very comfortably with Karamat. I think he likes the idea of being someone who has almost created himself out of sheer will, though of course he really hasn't.
yeah. Son of a bus
Yeah.
driver, son of a taxi driver sort of narrative. Um, we've got lots of great questions coming in. So another question around the ending. So why did you decide to have the reader experience the ending through Karamat's narrative and through a TV screen? And by extension, there's a motif of technology in the novel providing connection between characters, but not full connection. Why did you decide to do that?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I'm glad it got raised because I was interested with the novel in the way that media and social media and images and videos are mediating our understanding of the world. We see things and we see them almost as though they're the truth, but there is always the camera angle and they're the things you don't see. So there is that moment in the end where one of them whispers something to the other, and I've had people say, well, what does she whisper? And I'll never tell, because the point is there is an intimacy that the camera will not capture. There is something you cannot know just by looking on the screen. And so it is this sort of mediated through the screen, through the news channels, but through also the lens of a particular camera that is catching what it's catching and nothing else. And I wanted to make visible, I suppose, the camera lens that so often isn't. We just think, so this is what happened because this is what I saw. And my point is also, no, this is what you saw from this particular angle, often edited in a certain way or editorialized in a certain way. But also, I did want to have that sense of this final scene. Everyone is going to be viewing this. Isma will be seeing this. Karamat will be seeing this. His wife will be seeing this. Other politicians will be seeing this. The electorate will be seeing this. Everyone who's been tweeting about it will be seeing this. How would you see it? You as the reader, how are you seeing it?
Wonderful, thank you. I'd love to ask some more sort of general questions now. So, somebody has said that they found Home Fire tragic, beautiful, and thought provoking. And obviously, it started to be introduced on English literature curriculums. What are your thoughts on the novel reaching a wider audience and being read by students? And how would you have felt as a 17-year-old studying Home Fire or a book like it?
I mean, it's one of the most thrilling things that's happened to me in my writing life is to have this taught in schools. Because I mean, it's just an obvious thing that as a writer, you want your book to reach a large audience. But just because I remember the texts that I studied at school, I was looking at, I remember them very deeply. And I mean, the ones you dislike, of course, you really dislike. So my apologies to anyone who thinks, why am I stuck with this book? But there is a level of engagement and conversation that can happen around a text that it's wonderful. How would I have felt? I I mean, it's so hard to talk about your own book in that way. Um, I think if I had a book that was talking about the world I was living in rather than one from decades ago and from a different country, I think that would have been sort of exciting. And I think it might have made me feel that I had a more personal stake in it. Um, and also maybe give me more of a feeling of authority to talk about it and argue back against it and say, no, or to say to other people or to the teacher, actually, this is how I interpret this moment. Um, Whereas if you're reading something that comes to you at a great remove, I think sometimes particularly when you're a younger reader, I think it can be hard to feel that sense of ownership.
Um, are there books that somebody asks? Are there books that you would recommend as sort of must reads for this audience? So GCSE, A level age, 16 to kind of 18.
So first of all, I think 16 to 18, there's really nothing you can't read. Um, you know, I mean, it's a great read. I think a lot of my most sort of intensive reading was happening um, at that age. Oh, I don't know. I mean, there's so many incredible writers out there. I think I mean, I think of all the writers who are writing about Britain today, I think Ali Smith is wonderful in the way she takes really the contemporary world and makes it art. So I think she's really wonderful. I still think 20 years after it's published, Nadeem Aslam's Maps for Lost Lovers is a really extraordinary novel that people should be reading. Um, I also think people need to sort of find, what their particular shtick is. I think David Mitchell is brilliant. I think Shihan Karunatilaka, who just won the Booker Prize, I think he's a brilliant writer. My favorite writer of all time is Michael Ondaatje. Um, But you find the books you read at different moments in time. At 18, Virginia Woolf was remarkably important to me. Um, so you get
Mm.
a whole range of writers and voices in.
Wonderful. So another question about home fire and sort of the context of it. So in home fire, there are several references to colonial legacies and their connection to present day racism. Do you think that Islamophobia as it exists today is a colonial legacy or a purely post 9/11 phenomenon? Obviously, in the context of the UK, I guess, and the West.
I mean, first, I think it's necessary to say for those of us who can remember a time before 9/11, there was plenty of Islamophobia about. It didn't start. Nothing. There's phrase that often gets used about 9/11 to do with the weather that day in New York, which is it came out of the blue. And in fact, nothing came out of the blue. That the events of that day didn't come out of the blue. There was a history behind them, and the Islamophobia that followed didn't come out of the blue either. There is, of course, a colonial legacy. There's a pre-colonial legacy. I mean, between what we now talk of as the Islamic world and the West used to once be talked of Christianity and the Islamic world. There was a reason why George Bush, I think on September 12th or 13th, used the word crusade. There are very, very old stories that can be tapped into of, very dangerous stories of difference and opposition. But yeah, very much. I mean, Islamophobia is part of racism in Britain today, and racism is all over the world, but it exists in different forms and has different histories everywhere it goes. And in Britain, it comes very much out of colonial rule, absolutely. And the whole idea, the British Empire was based. It sort of based its morality on the idea of the civilizing mission, which comes from the notion we are superior. Um, and as long as you have that idea anywhere in your national psyche still, as soon as you say, well, there were some good things about empire, what you're talking about is an idea that had at its very root and core this really ideology of the civilizing mission. And until you get rid of that, as long as people are still saying, well, the nice thing about empire, there were some problems, but basically, you're defending the civilizing mission. You're defending this idea of racism, and it's not just about Muslims. It's about all peoples who were colonized and their descendants.
Mm. So then this final question, I think, leads on from there. Is Britain's transition into the post-colonial present progressing or stagnating, do you think?
Well, I think it's optimistic to not put sliding back as one of the options in there. So it's one of the reasons why you need to write novels rather than, you know, or why I need to write novels rather than um, sort of short form journalism is that for every moment there is another moment, or for everything you could say. On one hand, there are things that are much better um, than there were 50 years ago. My mother was in Britain for boarding school, and so she's had an ongoing history with London. And she says, I remember the days when, I'd call up and ask for a room to rent. And because she'd been educated in a posh kind of school, she had a certain accent, and the person would say, yes, of course. And then she would turn up at the door and they would take one look at her brown skin and say, no room for rent, love. Um,
Mm,
and now there are laws against that. So there are certain things that have changed and the laws have changed. And but there is also a sliding back. I think the citizenship stripping laws is a huge slide back. I think a lot of the rhetoric around Brexit and the sort of re-glorification of empire is a huge slide back. So, if you're really optimistic, you say that a dying system will fight and claw more viciously than any other to hold on to its powers. That's the optimistic take. So let's go
mm.
with that. Yeah.
Okay, let's end on that optimistic note then. That is
Go
all
with
that we have. time for, I'm afraid. Thank you so much to everybody watching for all of your questions. And I'm sorry that we couldn't get through more, but I hope that you really enjoy reading and studying the novel. And finally, thank you very, very much to Kamla for your time today. It's so much appreciated.
Thank you, Sarah,
Goodbye.
and Lytton and everyone. Thank you.